In this video, I want to start off by talking about the main house at Gray Towers in Milford, Pennsylvania, and go a little bit into the family history involved associated with the house. Gray Towers is huge. It's 19,000 square feet, and it's on a good-sized piece of property, 102 acres. And this house was built by James Wallace Pinchot in the late 1800s, 1886, and it was built for a family of 5. So with only 5 people, they still felt the need to have 43 rooms, 23 fireplaces, 16 bedrooms, not including the servants' wing, and it also had 4 water closets, so they didn't have to go to the bathroom outside. And it was built for only $1.4 million in today's dollars. I thought it would be worth a lot more. It was designed by a famous architect of the time, Richard Morris Hunt, and it's not as expensive maybe as one would think because they used local building materials for the stone for the walls, and the slate came from nearby New Jersey, the slate roof. So that's one reason. And then also it might have been on the basic side, and then later the next generation they built out more things and upgraded the interiors of the house. So it's a beautiful house. You can take a tour. They just let you go in the first floor and you have to buy a ticket, and they have docents on hand from the National Forestry Service, possibly the National Park Service, but they're there to answer any questions and sort of give brief little mini tours of different aspects of the house. And I talked to a few of the rangers or docents, and they're very well informed, so it was useful to go inside. And the upper floors are where the bedrooms are, and those have been converted to offices for the Institute for Conservation Studies that President Kennedy dedicated in 1963. So this is the part of the original family that occupied the house, and they used it mostly just as a summer house. Very well-off family. James Pinchot, he made his money in French wallpaper that he imported, and they also owned a lot of real estate in Manhattan, and his father made a lot of money in lumbering in the Milford area. So what is now heavily forested was in the late 1800s was all cut down, and people made a lot of money in various towns in the area in New York and Pennsylvania in lumbering. So it was just building on itself, and he was having a successful business too in a separate line of work in wallpaper. Anyway, that's how they were able to afford the Gray Towers estate, and then they also owned a brownstone in Gramercy Park in Manhattan, and they also, I don't know if they held on to that house in Manhattan, but then they also owned a very large home in Washington, D.C. So they owned a lot of real estate. So they had James Wallace Pinchot, and he married Mary Jane Eno, who came from a wealthy family also, was also heavily involved in Manhattan real estate, and she was from Connecticut. So they had 3 children, and the oldest child pictured here is Gifford Pinchot, who became a governor of Pennsylvania. Back in the early 1900s, they didn't allow you to serve consecutive terms, so he served a 4-year term, and then there was term limits, so he couldn't be governor again, but then he could come back and run again. You could do that as many times as you wanted. So he served 2 different terms, 4 years apart, and he was also born in Connecticut. And they also had 2 more children, a daughter who wound up marrying a British ambassador to other countries in Europe, so she lived over there and was pretty much out of the picture. She'd come back to visit and she'd correspond with. Then there was one younger brother, Amos Pinchot, and Amos Pinchot was the father of Mary Pinchot. So this just shows the 2 brothers, and they each had 2 women in their lives. Gifford Pinchot, when he was younger, he was dating, and I believe he was engaged to a woman, Laura Houteling, who was originally from Chicago, but she had tuberculosis and she died young, and it took him a long time to get over it, like 20 years not wanting to be with anybody else, until his parents kind of nudged him and they said, if you're going to have a political career, you've got to have a wife. So he wound up marrying Lila Bryce, and she was also very politically motivated. She ran for Congress a few times after women were given the right to vote in 1920, and she was really helpful in getting the women's vote out for Gifford Pinchot when he ran for governor. If it wasn't for her rallying the women to vote for him, he probably wouldn't have become a governor. So she was very instrumental and helpful. So they were married in 1914, and then women's suffrage, the women's right to vote, came in 1920, and then his career as a governor really took off. And before that, he was made the head of the U.S. Forestry Division of the Department of Agriculture. He became the United States' first forester, and he had gone to Europe to study it, and it was a brand new field. His father actually suggested the idea to him, and he followed his father to Yale, and that's where they started the forestry program at Yale. And they still have that forestry program today. And the main thrust of it was don't cut everything down, be more judicious in terms of what you do cut down, and then what you cut down, replace it with new trees so that you're not having a totally barren landscape. It was kind of a environmental thing, but he also wanted to use the forest for actual production of lumber as a commodity, as a crop. So that's why forestry program was in the Department of Agriculture. And then he was born in 1865, and his brother Amos was born 8 years later. And his brother Amos was a lot like him, but also very different in various ways, which I'll go into further. He sort of followed in Gifford's shadow. He also went to Yale, and his career never really gelled in terms of what he actually did for a living. He went to law school, and then he started to practice law, but he didn't really like it, so he would prefer writing, and a lot of times he would write for magazines or publications, and he'd be paid somewhat for them, but a lot of times he wasn't paid. He also managed the family's real estate investments, but that was not a growing business, so his fortunes sort of gradually went down over time, and he married his first time to a woman from a wealthy family, the Minturn family. He married Gertrude Minturn in 1900, and they had 2 children, and then they were divorced, which was fairly uncommon in the early 1900s, in 1918. And then he remarried a woman who was 20 years younger, Ruth Pickering, married her the following year in 1919, and then Mary Pinchot was born the next year in 1920, and then she had a younger sister, Tony, who was born 4 years after that. So those are the 2 sides of the Pinchot family that relate to Gray Towers. This is the overall layout of Gray Towers, and it's dominated by the main house. And as I mentioned, James and Mary, who had the house built, they also had their townhouse in Gramercy Park. So they sort of split time between Manhattan and Gray Towers, using Gray Towers mostly just during the summer. Where they lived in Gramercy Park was on one side of the park, and then on another side of the park there was another famous resident, Samuel Tilden, who was a former governor of New York who ran for president and narrowly missed being elected. And he also owned an estate outside of the city called Greystone, the Greystone Mansion in Yonkers. And there's still a Greystone section of Yonkers. I don't believe the mansion still exists. The Pinchots had 300 plus acres, and they donated 100 acres along with the house to the federal government to be used as an institute for conservation studies. And the estate is located just west of the town of Milford, which is right on the Delaware River. During the early 1900s, Amos Pinchot and his first wife and his first 2 children, they occupied the main house at Gray Towers. And then when Gifford Pinchot got married in 1914, he lived mostly in New York City, but he still would come back to the estate. And then as his political career started to develop, he needed to have a residence in Pennsylvania. And so I don't know what the conversation was between the 2 brothers, but it was decided that Gifford Pinchot and his wife would move into the main house, and Amos Pinchot would move to a smaller house on the estate, much smaller. They call it the Forester's Cottage now. It was built after the main house was built. It was built in 1897. It was designed by another famous architectural firm from New York City, McKim, Mead and White, and the White is Stanford White, who I'll talk about briefly later. But it's a 6-bedroom house. It has 4 baths, and I'll talk much more about the house later. But the main takeaway here is that Amos Pinchot and his family moved to the smaller house, and Gifford Pinchot moved into the main house, worthy of a future governor. And from there, he became governor of Pennsylvania. So the Amos Pinchot family moved from the big house to the much smaller house. And the much smaller house is where President Kennedy visited with the Pinchot sisters, Mary and Tony, and their mother, as well as their cousin, Gifford Pinchot's son, who was also called Gifford Pinchot. And they went inside the Forester's cottage house, and Mary and Tony showed the president their childhood picture albums, which I'd love to see because there aren't that many pictures available of Mary Pinchot, and this would be a whole another set of photos that would be interesting to see to help get a bigger, better picture of her life. Amos Pinchot might have had to move to the smaller house on the Gray Towers estate, but he still owned this fairly substantial house on Park Avenue, north of Grand Central. It was at the corner of Park and 85th, 1021 Park Avenue. They built this house when Park Avenue wasn't as stylish, but then they covered over train tracks that led to Grand Central, so that's when Park Avenue became an attractive street to move to, and people would be building their mansions and houses there. And they lived here for a while, but his marriage to Gertrude Minturn was disintegrating, and I don't think the income was coming in because he was spending his time writing and getting involved in causes, but I'm not so sure how much money he was really bringing in. So they wound up renting the house, and they rented it to some of the most elite families in New York and in the U.S., first to the Astors and then the Vanderbilts, and they rented it for the equivalent of $550,000 a year in today's dollars for several years. But then, for whatever reason, probably economic, they sold it in 1917, and then it was occupied by another family, but then it was ultimately demolished in 1928 and replaced by a brick apartment building. Amos moved out and got divorced. He wound up remarrying following year in 1919, and with his new young wife, he moved into an apartment building, also on Park Avenue on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. And first they occupied 1125 Park Avenue, and they had half of a floor, so still not doing too badly. But then times kept getting tighter, so they moved up a couple blocks up Park Avenue. They didn't want to move any other neighborhood. They stayed on the Upper East Side, but they moved further north to 92nd Street, where they occupied a quarter of the floor. So Amos Pinchot, he was downsizing both out in Pennsylvania and in New York. This is what Park Avenue looks like today, looking north. It used to be lined with single-family mansions, and now it's lined with apartment buildings pre-war. So let's take a look at where they lived on the Upper East Side. This is the building at 1125 Park Avenue that Mary Pinchot grew up in when she was in New York City, when she wasn't in Pennsylvania. And then her family owned like a half a floor in this building, and then times got tough in the late 20s and they moved up the street 2 blocks to a unit that was a quarter of the floor. So let's walk up to the next building. It's funny, I'm roughly familiar with this building because I used to go to a dermatologist in this building at 90th and Park. And here's the lobby, pre-war building. And so here's where they moved up to when they downsized at 92nd and Park, 1165 Park Avenue. I think this is just where Mary's mother lived, Ruth Peckrell Pinchot, after her dad died. And maybe her sister, who was 4 years younger, lived here when she went to school. But Mary had gone away to college by this time. There's really hardly any difference between the two buildings, 1125 and 1165 Park Avenue. It just must have been what was available. They needed to have a smaller unit, and there wasn't one available on 1125, so they moved up the street 2 blocks to 1165. So here's like one of the last mansions that's still here on Park Avenue, and you can see it's all been replaced with these 12, 14-story tall pre-war buildings built in the 1920s. That's the Park Avenue of today, the way it's been for 100 years now.